The Demon Core. In the summer of 1945, while the world celebrated the end of World War II, a small group of physicists at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico were about to commit a quiet, fatal error. They had already built the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But after the war, they continued their experiments with plutonium. Their goal was simple: understand the exact moment when a critical mass becomes a chain reaction. The device they used was a 6.2 kilogram sphere of plutonium-gallium alloy, originally intended for a third atomic bomb. This sphere was not yet complete. It had two hollow hemispheres that fit together like a shell. When separated, the sphere was harmless. When brought together, it became a nuclear reactor the size of an orange. The scientists called it Rufus. But after what happened next, history would remember it by a different name: the Demon Core. The experiment was routine. A physicist named Harry Daghlian worked alone at night on August 21, 1945. He was building a neutron reflector around the core. The reflector was made of tungsten carbide bricks, each about the size of a small book. The idea was to stack these bricks around the plutonium sphere to bounce neutrons back into the metal, bringing it closer to supercriticality. Daghlian carefully placed brick after brick, measuring the rise in neutron radiation with a simple counter. He was only one brick away from the desired level. Then he saw the counter spike. He had accidentally dropped a brick directly onto the core. The room filled with a blue flash. That blue glow was Cherenkov radiation, the visual signature of electrons moving faster than light through the air. It was also the color of death. Daghlian instinctively grabbed the brick with his bare hand and threw it away, stopping the reaction. But the damage was already done. He had received a lethal dose of neutron radiation, about 510 rem. For context, 100 rem causes radiation sickness. 400 rem is fatal in 50% of cases. Daghlian received more than 5 times that dose. He was hospitalized immediately. His hands swelled. Blisters covered his torso. His skin peeled away in layers. 25 days later, he died. He was 24 years old. The Demon Core did not stop. 9 months later, on May 21, 1946, a second physicist named Louis Slotin took over similar experiments. Slotin was a showman. He had developed a faster method to test the core's criticality. Instead of stacking bricks, he placed 2 hemispherical beryllium shells around the plutonium sphere. Beryllium is an even better neutron reflector than tungsten. Slotin controlled the gap between the 2 shells using a single screwdriver. He would slowly close the gap, let the counter click faster, then open the gap before the reaction became self-sustaining. His colleagues called it tickling the dragon's tail. The dragon did not appreciate being tickled. On that May morning, 7 other scientists were in the room. Slotin's screwdriver slipped. The 2 beryllium shells snapped shut completely. Instantly, the core went prompt critical, a massive burst of energy in a fraction of a second. The blue flash returned. Slotin felt a wave of heat on his face. He tasted acid in his mouth. He tore the shells apart with his bare hands, ending the reaction. But he had already absorbed an estimated 2,100 rem, 4 times the lethal dose. He walked out of the room, vomited, and told his colleagues, "Well, that does it. What happened next is a medical horror story rarely told." Slotin did not die from burns. He died because the neutrons had destroyed the stem cells in his bone marrow. Without stem cells, his body could not produce new blood. His white blood cell count dropped to 0. His immune system vanished. Then his platelet count collapsed, meaning his blood could not clot. He bled from his mouth, his nose, his intestines. An autopsy later showed that his chromosomes had shattered into hundreds of fragments. His cells simply forgot how to divide. 9 days after the accident, Louis Slotin died. The 7 other people in the room survived, but only after years of health problems. One developed permanent neurological damage. Another died of leukemia decades later. The Demon Core was eventually melted down and recycled into other nuclear weapons. But its legacy is not just 2 deaths. It is a lesson about the arrogance of familiarity. These were not amateurs. They were the best physicists in the world. They knew the risks. They had safety protocols. But they worked late, they took shortcuts, and they believed their hands were fast enough to outrun a chain reaction. They were wrong. The demon core did not explode. It did not need to. It simply emitted a silent, invisible rain of neutrons that unzipped the very fabric of human biology. And for the rest of their short lives, both Daglian and Slotin remained fully conscious, watching their own bodies fail from the inside. That is what scientists created. Not a monster with teeth, but a small metal sphere that could kill a man without touching him, without burning him, without making a sound. The demon core remains one of the most terrifying objects ever made. Not because it was complex, but because it was simple. 2 halves, 1 screwdriver, and a blue light that meant you were already dead. The Radioactive Boy Scout. In 1994, a 17-year-old boy named David Hahn built a nuclear reactor in a backyard shed in Commerce Township, Michigan. He was not a physicist. He was not a graduate student. He was an Eagle Scout candidate working on a merit badge in atomic energy. His stepmother described his bedroom as a laboratory. His father described it as a mess. But inside that shed, behind a rusted tool bench and a lawnmower, David Hahn attempted something no teenager had ever tried. He wanted to build a breeder reactor. He did not succeed in creating a sustained chain reaction, but he came terrifyingly close. And in the process, he turned his suburban neighborhood into an EPA Superfund cleanup site. Hahn was a lonely, obsessive young man. His parents were divorced. His father was a former engineer who drank too much. His stepmother was exhausted by David's experiments. At school, he was bullied, so he retreated into science. He read every book on nuclear chemistry he could find. He memorized the periodic table. He wrote letters to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission pretending to be a college professor. The NRC sent him information about reactor design. Then he began collecting radioactive materials. This is the part that seems impossible, but it is all true. Hahn extracted americium-241 from more than 100 smoke detectors. Smoke detectors contain about 1 microcurie of americium. Hahn needed thousands of microcuries. He pried open each detector with a screwdriver, scraped the americium off the foil, and concentrated it into a paste. He bought thorium-232 from camping lantern mantles. He bought radium-226 from old military compasses and clock dials. He bought lithium from lithium batteries and crushed it with a hammer. He even tried to extract plutonium from tritium gun sights, though he failed at that step. His method was crude but logical. He wanted to create a neutron source. Americium emits alpha particles. Alpha particles cannot penetrate skin. But if you wrap americium in a thin sheet of aluminum, the alpha particles strike the aluminum atoms and knock out neutrons. Neutrons are dangerous. Neutrons penetrate everything. And neutrons, if you have enough of them, can turn ordinary uranium into plutonium. Hahn did not have uranium, so he substituted thorium. Thorium-232, when hit by a neutron, becomes thorium-233, which decays into protactinium-233, which decays into uranium-233. Uranium-233 is fissile. That means it can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. In theory, a backyard reactor was possible. In practice, Hahn built a device he called a neutron howitzer. He placed his americium paste inside a hollow block of lead. He drilled a hole in the lead and inserted a smaller container of thorium ash. Then he wrapped the entire assembly in aluminum foil and waited. The device worked in the most terrifying sense of the word. A Geiger counter placed next to the howitzer registered 5,000 counts per minute. Background radiation is about 30 counts per minute. Hahn had created an object that emitted 40 times more radiation than the natural environment. He did not own a radiation badge. He did not own a lead apron. He handled everything with bare hands. He later told reporters that his fingers sometimes felt numb. He said he had sores that would not heal. He said he had no idea why. The end came on August 31, 1994. Police were called to David's car because someone reported a suspicious person loitering near a strip mall. When the officer opened the trunk, he found a locked footlocker wrapped in chains. Inside the footlocker were dozens of plastic bags, glass jars, and metal tins, all covered with yellow radioactive warning tape. Inside the containers were powders, liquids, and small metal discs. The officer touched one of the discs. His fingers later tested positive for radioactive contamination. The police called the FBI. The FBI called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The NRC called the Environmental Protection Agency. Within 24 hours, a 10-block radius of David Hahn's neighborhood was cordoned off. A hazmat team in full protective suits dismantled the shed. They removed the lead howitzer. They removed the lawnmower. They removed the workbench, the dirt floor, and 3 feet of subsoil. Everything was packed into 44 radioactive waste barrels and shipped to a desert disposal site in Utah. The cleanup cost taxpayers an estimated $60,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is over $100,000 today. David Hahn was not arrested. He was not charged with any crime. In 1994, there were no laws against a private citizen building a nuclear reactor in their backyard. The NRC simply confiscated his materials and told him to stop. He later joined the Navy, but was discharged after developing symptoms of radiation poisoning. He died in 2016 at the age of 39. The cause of death was acute myeloid leukemia, a cancer strongly linked to radiation exposure. His father, who had watched David tinker in the shed for years, later admitted that he never understood what his son was building. He thought it was just a hobby. A teenage boy with a screwdriver, a pile of smoke detectors, and a dream of atomic energy did what no enemy state could do. He brought a nuclear reactor to a suburban driveway. The Radioactive Boy Scout is not a story about evil. It is a story about ignorance, loneliness, and the terrifying gap between theoretical knowledge and practical safety. David Hahn knew the physics. He did not know the consequences. And by the time he learned, his own DNA was already rewriting itself into cancer. The Robo-Roach. In 2010, a team of engineers at the University of California, Berkeley, led by Dr. Hirotaka Sato, then a postdoctoral researcher, announced a breakthrough in neural engineering. They had successfully created a living insect that could be controlled by a smartphone. The insect was a Madagascar hissing cockroach, a species 6 centimeters long with a shiny brown exoskeleton and 2 antennae that wave constantly in search of food. The scientists implanted electrodes into the roach's antennae and into a cluster of nerves near its brain called the optic lobes. They attached a miniature circuit board to its back, powered by a tiny rechargeable battery. Then they wrote a software program that sent electrical pulses to the roach's nervous system. A pulse to the left antenna made the roach turn right. A pulse to the right antenna made it turn left. Pulses to the optic lobes tricked the roach into perceiving an invisible wall, causing it to stop or move forward. The roach did not resist, could not resist. Its own nervous system had been hijacked. The researchers called their invention the Robo-Roach. They demonstrated it live for journalists. A researcher opened an app on an iPhone. He swiped left. The roach turned left. He swiped right. The roach turned right. He pressed a button labeled forward. The roach walked in a straight line across a white table, stepping over a small crack, pausing only when the signal told it to pause. The roach was alive. It breathed. Its legs moved with organic coordination. Its antennae twitched spontaneously between commands. But its will was gone. Every navigational decision originated not in its own brain, but in a silicon chip no larger than a fingernail. The engineers called this biobot control. A more accurate term would be neural puppetry. The stated purpose of the Robo-Roach was search and rescue. After an earthquake or a building collapse, a swarm of Robo-Roaches could crawl through rubble too small for human rescuers or wheeled robots. Their biological legs, unlike metal tracks or rubber tires, can climb vertical walls, traverse uneven debris, and squeeze through gaps just 2 millimeters high. A camera the size of a grain of rice could be mounted on the roach's back, transmitting video to rescue workers. The roach would carry the camera. The human would steer the roach. The roach would not need to understand the mission. It would not need to consent. It would simply walk where the electrical pulses told it to walk. From an engineering perspective, this was elegant. From a biological perspective, it was something else entirely. The deeper terror of the Robo-Roach lies not in the roach itself, but in the principle it demonstrates. If a human can control a cockroach's legs through implanted electrodes, then the same technology could theoretically be applied to larger animals. Rats have already been controlled remotely. Pigeons have been guided by electrical stimulation of their flight muscles. Sharks have been steered using signals from their olfactory nerves. In 2012, a team at the State University of New York Downstate Medical Center controlled a rat through a complex maze, turning it left and right with joystick commands, forcing it to climb stairs and cross open platforms. The rat's own whiskers still twitched. Its nose still sniffed the air. But its path was dictated by a graduate student with a laptop. The rat did not appear distressed. That is the most unsettling detail. Animals do not understand the concept of remote control. They do not know that their movements are being generated by a signal from outside their bodies. They simply feel a strange impulse to turn left, so they turn left. They feel a strange impulse to stop, so they stop. From the animal's perspective, these commands feel like their own thoughts. The brain has no mechanism to distinguish between a self-generated neural signal and an artificially implanted one. The ethical implications of the Robo-Roach have been debated in scientific journals for over a decade. Some researchers argue that insects lack the neural complexity to suffer. A cockroach does not have a cerebral cortex. It does not feel fear or pain in the way a mammal does. Its nervous system is essentially a set of reflex arcs. Steering a roach with electrodes is no different from steering a car with a steering wheel. Other researchers disagree. They point out that cockroaches learn from experience. They avoid light. They seek darkness. They choose mates. They remember the layout of their environment. When a robo-roach is forced to walk into a bright, open space against its natural instincts, is that not a form of distress? The Berkeley team acknowledged the concern. They added a safety override to their software. If the roach's body temperature rose too high, or if it stopped moving for more than 10 seconds, the electrodes would shut off automatically. But the roach could not shut them off itself. It had no off switch of its own. As of 2024, the Robo-Roach has not been deployed in any real disaster. The technology remains in university laboratories. But the military has taken notice. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, has funded similar research into insect-borne sensors. The idea is not just search and rescue, but surveillance. A swarm of robo-roaches released into a building could map every room, every hallway, every ventilation duct. They could transmit audio. They could transmit video. They could be indistinguishable from ordinary cockroaches, except for the tiny circuit boards glued to their backs. No one would notice them. No one would think to swat them. And they would not resist. They would simply walk where the signal told them to walk, carrying their cameras and microphones deeper and deeper into the space, turning left when the engineer swiped left, turning right when the engineer swiped right, alive but not autonomous, biological but not free. Project MKUltra. In 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a secret program so vast, so illegal, and so morally broken that its full extent remains unknown to this day. The program was called MKUltra. The name means nothing. It was a random code assigned by CIA administrators. But what the code concealed was a 15-year campaign to crack the human mind. The goal of MKUltra was simple to state and impossible to defend: develop techniques for mind control. The CIA wanted to know if a person could be forced to betray their country, reveal secrets, or assassinate a target without remembering the act. They wanted a chemical that could turn any human being into a puppet. They never found it, but in the process of searching, they destroyed hundreds of lives. The man behind MKUltra was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist with a doctorate from Caltech and a limp from childhood polio. Gottlieb believed that psychedelic drugs were the key to mind control. His logic was brutal but internally consistent. LSD, discovered in 1943, produces profound alterations in consciousness. It dissolves ego boundaries. It makes users highly suggestible. If a person under LSD could be programmed with new beliefs, new memories, or new commands, then the CIA would have the ultimate interrogation weapon. Gottlieb obtained massive quantities of LSD from the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz. The CIA purchased the drug under fake names, using shell companies and secret bank accounts. Then Gottlieb began testing it on human subjects. The subjects did not consent. They did not even know they were part of an experiment. The testing took place in hospitals, prisons, and CIA safe houses across America and Europe. In New York, the CIA set up a brothel in San Francisco to test drugs on unsuspecting men. The men would be invited to the brothel, plied with alcohol or LSD, and observed through one-way mirrors. They never knew they were being watched. They never knew their drinks were laced. In Kentucky, the CIA funded psychiatric research at a prison hospital. Prisoners were offered money or early release in exchange for participating in drug studies. They were given LSD for weeks at a time, sometimes locked in isolation cells, sometimes interrogated by fake enemy agents. The goal was to simulate a brainwashing scenario. The prisoners later described seeing their own childhood memories played out as hallucinations. Some believed they had died and gone to hell. One prisoner was given LSD for 174 consecutive days. After that experiment ended, he refused to speak for 3 months. The most famous MKUltra victim was not a prisoner or a prostitute. He was a civilian scientist named Dr. Frank Olson. Olson worked for the U.S. Army's biological weapons program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He was not a target. He was a colleague. In November 1953, Olson attended a 2-day retreat at a remote cabin in Maryland with other CIA and Army scientists. On the second night, his supervisor, a CIA officer named Robert Lashbrook, put LSD into a bottle of Cointreau. Lashbrook later claimed it was a spur-of-the-moment decision. Olson drank the liqueur and became violently disoriented. He spoke of conspiracies. He said he felt like he was falling. He tried to jump out a window. Lashbrook and others restrained him. They drove him to New York City and put him in a hotel room with a doctor. 9 days after the LSD was administered, Olson jumped from the 10th floor window of his hotel room. He landed on the roof of a 3-story building below. He died instantly. The CIA told his family that Olson had suffered a psychotic episode and committed suicide. The family believed this for 22 years. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission investigating CIA abuses revealed the truth. Olson had not gone insane. He had been dosed without his knowledge by his own colleagues. Frank Olson's son, Eric, spent decades fighting for justice. In 1996, the Olson family received a formal apology from President Bill Clinton. They also received a financial settlement of $750,000. But the CIA never admitted that the LSD caused Olson's death. The official position remains that Olson had a pre-existing mental illness. The same position was applied to every other MKUltra victim. The government destroyed most MKUltra records in 1973. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all documents shredded. Only a few boxes survived, mostly financial records and memos that escaped the shredder. These surviving documents reference experiments that can no longer be investigated. They list code names like Operation Midnight Climax and Project Artichoke. They mention drugs like barbiturates, amphetamines, scopolamine, and heroin. They describe electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and verbal abuse. But the names of most victims are gone. The details of most experiments are gone. The truth of what the CIA did to its own citizens has been reduced to a paper trail of canceled checks and redacted memos. MKUltra ended officially in 1963, though some researchers believe smaller programs continued into the 1970s. The CIA never achieved mind control. LSD did not turn people into programmable robots. What LSD did was cause psychosis, suicide, and lifelong trauma. The scientists who created MKUltra believed they were protecting America from enemies who might develop mind control first. They were wrong about the threat. They were wrong about the methods. And they were wrong to believe that the human mind could be reduced to a set of chemical switches. The mind is not a machine, cannot be rewired without breaking it. MKUltra broke dozens of minds. And the only lesson the CIA learned was how to hide the evidence. The Philadelphia experiment. The story of the Philadelphia experiment exists in a strange space between fact and fiction. What is known is this. In the autumn of 1943, the United States Navy was actively researching ways to make its ships invisible to enemy radar. This research was real. It took place at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard and later at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. The scientific principle was called degaussing. A ship's steel hull creates a magnetic field that can trigger magnetic mines. Degaussing involves wrapping cables around the hull and running an electrical current through them to cancel out the ship's magnetic signature. The Navy successfully degaussed thousands of ships during World War II. But a rumor emerged from that research, a rumor that has never been fully confirmed or fully debunked. The rumor claims that the Navy attempted something far more ambitious than degaussing. It claims they attempted to make a ship not just invisible to radar, but invisible to light. And it claims that the experiment went catastrophically wrong. The ship at the center of the rumor was the USS Eldridge, a Cannon-class destroyer escort launched in July 1943. According to testimony collected decades later, the Eldridge was equipped with massive electromagnetic generators designed by a team that included Albert Einstein. Einstein did work for the Navy during World War II. He filed patents related to electromagnetic ship protection. This much is documented. The rumor states that on October 28, 1943, the generators were activated at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Witnesses aboard a nearby merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, reported seeing a greenish fog form around the Eldridge. Then the fog dissipated. When it cleared, the Eldridge was gone. In its place was nothing but open water. Minutes later, the Eldridge reappeared at a different location. Some witnesses claimed it teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, more than 200 miles away, before returning to Philadelphia. Other witnesses claimed the ship did not teleport. It simply vanished from sight while remaining in place. Either way, the rumor insists that something impossible occurred. The human cost of the Philadelphia experiment, according to the rumor, was the truly terrifying part. When the Eldridge reappeared, some crew members were found fused into the metal of the ship. Their bodies had become embedded in the bulkheads. Others were reportedly suffering from severe mental disintegration, unable to speak or recognize their own names. Some simply disappeared entirely, never to be seen again. Still others, the rumor continues, later spontaneously dematerialized in bars and living rooms, vanishing in front of horrified witnesses. A man named Al Bielek became the most famous source for these claims. Bielek testified under hypnosis that he had been a crew member on the Eldridge, that he had traveled through time to the year 2137, and that he had been sent back to prevent a future catastrophe. Bielek's testimony changed with every telling. He later claimed that his brother had been fused into the ship's hull. He later claimed that the entire experiment was a hoax. He later claimed it was all true. Bielek died in 2011, leaving behind a tangled web of statements that cannot be reconciled. The Navy's official position is simple. The Philadelphia experiment never happened. In the 1990s, the Office of Naval Research published a fact sheet stating that the story originated from a series of misunderstandings and hoaxes. The Navy pointed out that the USS Eldridge's logbook shows the ship was not even in Philadelphia on October 28, 1943. According to the logbook, the Eldridge was on shakedown trials in the Bahamas. The SS Andrew Furuseth, the merchant ship that supposedly witnessed the event, was not in Philadelphia either. Its logbook places it in Norfolk. The Navy also noted that Albert Einstein's work for the Navy involved conventional explosives and magnetic mines, not teleportation. There are no declassified documents, no photographs, and no physical evidence to support the rumor. The entire story appears to rest on the testimony of a single man, Carl Meredith Allen, also known as Carlos Allende. Allen wrote a series of letters to the U.S. Navy in the 1950s describing the experiment. He later admitted that he had made up parts of the story to discredit a Navy researcher he disliked. He also claimed to have psychic powers. Yet the Philadelphia experiment refuses to die. It has inspired books, documentaries, and a major Hollywood film. The reason for its persistence is not evidence. The reason is fear. The idea that a military experiment could go so wrong that men become welded into steel is a primal horror. It speaks to the terror of technological power without understanding. The Navy was genuinely experimenting with electromagnetic fields in 1943. Scientists did not fully understand the biological effects of strong magnetic fields at that time. They still do not fully understand them today. Exposure to extremely strong magnetic fields can cause nausea, vertigo, and phosphenes. In theory, a powerful enough electromagnetic pulse could disrupt the electrical signals in the human nervous system. But there is no known mechanism by which a magnetic field could fuse human tissue into metal. That detail is pure fantasy. But it is fantasy that feels true. It feels like the kind of mistake that arrogant scientists might make, pushing beyond the boundaries of known physics and paying a price in human flesh. Whether the Philadelphia experiment happened or not, the story serves a purpose. It warns against the military's desire for invisibility, for teleportation, for technologies that break the laws of nature. No ship ever vanished from Philadelphia. No sailor was ever embedded in a bulkhead. But somewhere in the classified archives of the Navy, there are documents about degaussing experiments that the public will never see. And in the gap between what is known and what is secret, the rumor continues to grow. The Philadelphia experiment is not a historical event. It is a modern myth about scientists who tried to control forces they did not understand. And like all good myths, it contains a kernel of truth. The Navy did experiment with invisibility. And no one knows exactly what they found. The strontium 90 tooth fairy study. In the late 1950s, American children across the Midwest and St. Louis area participated in a seemingly innocent ritual. They lost a baby tooth. They placed it under their pillow. And in the morning, the tooth fairy had replaced it with a coin. But behind this childhood tradition lurked a scientific operation of chilling proportions. The teeth were not being taken by a fairy. They were being collected by researchers at Washington University in St. Louis, led by Dr. Louise Rice. Her project, formerly known as the St. Louis Baby Tooth Survey, had a single terrifying goal: measure how much radioactive strontium-90 had accumulated in the bones of American children. The answer, when it came, was a nightmare that the nuclear industry did not want parents to hear. Strontium-90 is not a natural element. It is a byproduct of nuclear fission, created in atomic bomb explosions and nuclear reactor meltdowns. When a nuclear device detonates, it releases strontium-90 into the atmosphere. The radioactive particles rise into the stratosphere, travel thousands of miles on wind currents, and eventually fall back to Earth as fallout. Once on the ground, strontium-90 behaves very much like calcium. Plants absorb it from the soil. Cows eat the plants. Children drink the milk. And because the human body cannot distinguish strontium-90 from calcium, it incorporates the radioactive isotope directly into growing bones and teeth. Once embedded, strontium-90 emits beta particles for decades. Its half-life is 29 years. A child who absorbed strontium-90 in 1955 would still have half of that radioactive load in their bones in 1984. The baby tooth survey began in 1958, at the height of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were testing nuclear weapons above ground, in the atmosphere with no treaty restrictions. Between 1945 and 1963, more than 500 atmospheric nuclear tests were conducted worldwide. Each test added strontium-90 to the global environment. Scientists knew this was dangerous, but they did not know how dangerous. No one had ever measured the cumulative effect of fallout on human children. Dr. Rice and her colleagues designed a simple, elegant solution. They would collect baby teeth, which are essentially bone that has grown during early childhood. By measuring the strontium-90 in a lost tooth, they could calculate exactly how much radiation had been deposited in that child's skeleton. They needed tens of thousands of teeth. They needed parents to cooperate. So they invented the Tooth Fairy Project. Mothers were asked to mail their children's lost teeth to Washington University in pre-addressed envelopes. In return, they received a certificate and a small cash payment. Between 1958 and 1970, the project collected approximately 300,000 teeth. The results were devastating. In 1959, Dr. Rice published the first major findings. Strontium, 90 levels in children's teeth, had increased steadily every year since 1951. By 1959, the average child in St. Louis had 10 times more strontium, 90 in their bones than had been present at the start of the decade. Some children had 50 times the background level. The radioactive isotope was not a trace contaminant. It was a measurable, growing presence in the bodies of American youth. Dr. Rice presented her data to the United States Congress. She testified that strontium, 90 levels in children's bones were approaching what scientists considered the maximum permissible concentration for radiation workers. Radiation workers are adults who wear protective gear and dosimeters. Children were not wearing protective gear. Children were not choosing to be exposed. They were simply drinking milk, eating spinach, and playing in the soil of their own backyards. The political consequences of the baby tooth survey were immediate and historic. President John F. Kennedy had already been concerned about nuclear fallout. The St. Louis data gave him scientific ammunition. In 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited all nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Above-ground testing ended. Strontium 90 levels in children's teeth began to decline. By 1970, levels had dropped by more than half. The baby tooth survey had achieved its goal, but the horror of the study is not what it accomplished. The horror is what it revealed. For more than a decade, American scientists had known that children were accumulating radioactive poison in their bones. The Atomic Energy Commission, which funded much of the early nuclear testing, had conducted its own studies. Those studies showed the same trend. The AEC chose not to publish its findings. Dr. Rice and her team published anyway. The long-term health effects of strontium-90 exposure are still debated. Strontium-90 is a known carcinogen. It causes bone cancer and leukemia in laboratory animals. In humans, the epidemiological evidence is harder to gather because radiation exposure from fallout was widespread and diffuse. But the baby tooth survey left a permanent ethical scar. Parents had mailed their children's teeth thinking they were contributing to science. They were not told how alarming the results would be. They were not told that their own children might already be at risk. The tooth fairy, a symbol of childhood innocence, had become a courier for bad news. In 2001, the National Cancer Institute released a study estimating that atmospheric nuclear tests would cause approximately 11,000 excess cancer deaths in the United States. That number is small relative to the population. But it is not zero. And each of those deaths began with a silent, invisible particle of strontium-90, falling from the sky, settling on grass, passing into milk, and finally lodging itself in the growing bone of a child who had no way to refuse it. The Harvard Chimera monkeys. In 2019, a team of researchers led by a scientist affiliated with Harvard University and the Salk Institute published a study that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. They had created the first human-monkey chimeras. The term chimera comes from Greek mythology, a creature with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. In modern biology, a chimera is any organism containing cells from two different species. Scientists have created chimeras for decades. Mouse-rat chimeras, sheep-goat chimeras, even human-pig chimeras. But human-monkey chimeras were different. Monkeys are our evolutionary cousins. Their brains, their nervous systems, their very biology is closer to ours than any other animal on Earth. Mixing human cells into a monkey embryo meant crossing a line that many scientists believed should never be crossed. The experiment was conducted in China, at the Salk Institute's collaboration facility, under the supervision of Professor Juan Carlos Ispizua Belmonte. Belmonte had previously created human-pig chimeras with limited success. The human cells did not survive well in pig embryos. The evolutionary distance between humans and pigs was simply too great. So Belmonte decided to try a closer relative. He obtained monkey embryos from a macaque colony. The embryos were 6 days old at the blastocyst stage, a hollow ball of approximately 100 cells. Using a microscopic pipette, Belmonte's team injected human-induced pluripotent stem cells into each monkey embryo. These are adult human cells that have been reprogrammed to an embryonic state, capable of becoming any tissue in the body. The human cells were tagged with a green fluorescent protein, so researchers could track their movements under a microscope. The results were both successful and deeply unsettling. The human cells did not die. They integrated into the monkey embryos. They divided. They migrated. Within days, the green glow of human cells could be seen spreading throughout the chimeric embryos. Human cells contributed to the formation of endoderm, which becomes the gut and lungs. They contributed to mesoderm, which becomes muscle and blood. Most disturbingly, they contributed to ectoderm, which becomes skin and the nervous system. In some embryos, human cells were found in the developing neural crest, the precursor to the peripheral nervous system. The embryos were allowed to develop for up to 19 days. At that point, they were destroyed. International guidelines prohibit the gestation of human-animal chimeras beyond the 14th day of development, a limit originally established for human embryo research. The researchers extended to 19 days with special ethical approval, but no further. The chimeras never grew beyond a cluster of cells the size of a grain of rice. The scientific rationale for the experiment was ostensibly benevolent. Belmonte and his colleagues wanted to understand why human stem cells survive poorly in pig embryos. By using monkey embryos, which are evolutionarily closer, they hoped to identify the molecular signals that allow cross-species cell integration. The ultimate goal, as stated in the published paper, was to grow human organs inside animals for transplantation. A patient needing a new kidney could theoretically have one grown inside a pig or a sheep, using their own stem cells to prevent rejection. But that goal remains distant. The human-monkey chimeras, despite their success, still contained relatively few human cells. Most cells in each embryo remained monkey. The human cells were guests, not architects. The ethical reaction to the Harvard chimera monkeys was swift and severe. In Soo Hyun, a bioethicist at Harvard Medical School and Case Western Reserve University, was consulted before the experiment began. He approved the protocol, but with reservations. The primary concern, he wrote, was not the 19-day embryos themselves. The concern was the slippery slope. If human cells can integrate into monkey embryos, then what about monkey fetuses? What about monkeys born alive? What would happen if a chimeric monkey developed human-like neurons in its brain? Would that monkey have human consciousness? Would it have human rights? The National Institutes of Health imposed a moratorium on funding for human-animal chimera research in 2015, specifically citing concerns about brain chimeras. That moratorium remained in place for years, though it was later modified to allow case-by-case review. The Harvard chimera monkeys also raised questions about informed consent. The human stem cells used in the experiment came from donated embryos or adult tissues. The donors had consented to their cells being used for research. But had they consented to their cells being placed inside a monkey? Most donation forms from the early 2000s did not anticipate this scenario. Some ethicists argue that donors should be recontacted and asked for specific permission before their cells are used in chimera experiments. Others argue that this is impractical and unnecessary, as the cells are no longer human in any meaningful sense. They are just biological material. The debate remains unresolved. In 2021, a National Academies of Sciences panel concluded that current human-animal chimera research does not pose an immediate ethical crisis. The panel found no evidence that organoids or chimeras have human-like consciousness or the capacity to feel pain. But the panel also warned that this could change, particularly as experiments move into non-human primates. A monkey with a humanized brain would be a different category of being. It might have moral standing. It might deserve protection. The panel recommended a tiered oversight system, similar to that used for human embryo editing, with some experiments allowed, some requiring extra supervision, and some simply forbidden. The Harvard chimera monkeys are not monsters. They are not human-animal hybrids from a science fiction film. They are microscopic clusters of cells that lived for less than 3 weeks and were then destroyed. But they represent a door that has been opened. Once human cells have been placed inside a monkey embryo, the question is no longer whether it can be done. The question is how far scientists will go. The researchers who created the Harvard Chimera monkeys believe they are saving lives. They believe that growing human organs in animals will end transplant waiting lists and prevent thousands of deaths each year. Their critics believe they are playing with the definition of humanity itself. Both sides agree on one thing: the line between human and animal is not as clear as it once was. And scientists are the ones drawing it. The elephant's foot. In the spring of 1986, the worst nuclear accident in human history transformed the basement of a Soviet power plant into a place no human could safely enter. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located near the city of Pripyat in northern Ukraine, had exploded on April 26. Reactor number 4 blew its 1,000-ton steel lid into the air. Graphite blocks burned for 10 days, sending a plume of radioactive isotopes across Europe. But the explosion was only the beginning. Inside the ruined reactor, something else was forming. The nuclear fuel, consisting of uranium dioxide pellets encased in zirconium alloy tubes, had melted. It mixed with the sand, concrete, and steel of the reactor building. The mixture became a liquid, hotter than lava, flowing downward through cracks in the floor. It eventually pooled in the basement of the reactor, in a room designated Steam Distribution Corridor 217/2. There, the lava cooled and hardened into a solid mass. The mass was black, glassy, and wrinkled. It looked like the bark of a dead tree or the foot of an enormous animal. The workers who discovered it gave it a name. They called it the elephant's foot. The elephant's foot is not large. It measures approximately 2 meters across and 1 meter thick. Its weight is estimated at 10 metric tons. But its size is not what makes it terrifying. What makes the elephant's foot terrifying is what it emits. In the months after the accident, the radiation field at the surface of the elephant's foot measured approximately 10,000 Roentgens per hour. To understand that number, consider this. A dose of 500 Roentgens delivered to the whole body over a few hours is fatal to about half of the people who receive it. The elephant's foot delivered 500 Roentgens in 3 minutes. A person standing next to the elephant's foot for 30 seconds would experience acute radiation sickness. A person standing next to it for 2 minutes would experience vomiting, diarrhea, and internal bleeding. A person standing next to it for 4 minutes would be dead within 2 weeks. The elephant's foot was not a curiosity. It was a death warrant written in glass. The Soviet authorities needed to know what the elephant's foot was made of. They needed samples for analysis. But no human could approach the mass without dying. So they turned to remote technology. In the autumn of 1986, a team of engineers and dosimetrists mounted a camera on a wheeled cart and pushed it into the corridor using a long metal pole. The camera's electronics failed within minutes due to the radiation. They tried again with a more heavily shielded camera. That camera lasted longer, but the images it captured were blurry. Finally, in December 1986, a deputy director of the Chernobyl plant named Artur Korniev made a decision that many consider suicidal. He would approach the elephant's foot himself, wearing protective gear, and take photographs. Korniev was not a young man. He was in his late 40s. He had already been exposed to significant radiation during the cleanup. He knew the risks. He went anyway. Korniev entered Steam Distribution Corridor 217/2 with a dosimeter, a camera, and a flashlight. The corridor was dark. The elephant's foot glowed faintly from its own heat and radiation, a dull orange in the blackness. Korniev raised his camera. He took several photographs. Then he left. The photographs he brought back are the most famous images of the Chernobyl disaster. They show the elephant's foot as a rough, cracked, dark gray mass, like cooled volcanic rock but somehow more menacing. The dosimeter in the photographs is clearly visible. It reads thousands of Roentgens. Korniev survived. He died in 2019 at the age of 89, not from radiation but from old age. How he survived his encounter with the elephant's foot is a mystery. He later estimated that he had spent less than 2 minutes in the corridor. He also believed that the radiation field had decreased by the time of his visit, perhaps to 500 Roentgens per hour rather than 10,000. Even so, he received a dose that should have caused severe illness. It did not. Some people are unusually resistant to radiation. Korniev appears to have been one of them. The elephant's foot is not static. It changes. In the months after the accident, the mass was still warm, still emitting heat from ongoing nuclear reactions. It had not fully melted. It had not fully solidified. It was a ceramic-like material now known as Chernobylite, a complex mixture of uranium, zirconium, silicon, and oxygen. But Chernobylite is not stable. The elephant's foot is slowly breaking apart. Dust particles flake off its surface. These particles are radioactive. They can be carried by air currents. They can be inhaled. For this reason, the elephant's foot remains dangerous even today. In 2021, scientists returned to the Chernobyl basement with robots. They measured the radiation field at the surface of the elephant's foot. It had decreased significantly to about 50 roentgens per hour. 50 roentgens per hour is still lethal. A person standing next to the elephant's foot for 10 hours would receive a fatal dose. But the decrease means that the mass is decaying. Its most dangerous isotopes, like cesium-137 with a 30-year half-life, are slowly disappearing. In another 50 years, the elephant's foot will be merely dangerous rather than instantly lethal. In 200 years, it will be safe to approach without protective gear. The elephant's foot is not a creation in the sense that a bomb or a drug is a creation. No scientist sat down at a drawing board and designed the elephant's foot. It was an accident, a consequence of human error and physics. But it was created by scientists nonetheless. The scientists who designed the RBMK-1000 reactor, the type used at Chernobyl, knew that a meltdown was possible. They knew that if the reactor overheated, the fuel could liquefy and burn through the containment. They built the reactor anyway. They cut safety corners. They ran tests at low power without proper precautions. The elephant's foot is their legacy. It sits in a dark basement, slowly crumbling, still radiating death after nearly 4 decades. It is a monument to the arrogance of nuclear engineering, and it will outlive every person reading this sentence. The scientists who created the elephant's foot are mostly dead now. Some died in the explosion. Some died of radiation poisoning in the months after. Some died of cancer years later. But the elephant's foot remains, a black, glassy lump of nuclear lava, waiting for the next person foolish enough to approach. The Russian sleep experiment. The Russian sleep experiment is a story that does not want to be true. It circulates on internet forums, horror blogs, and creepypasta archives. It claims to describe a secret Soviet experiment from the late 1940s in which 5 political prisoners were kept awake for 15 consecutive days using a gas-based stimulant. The prisoners, according to the story, descended into psychosis, mutilated themselves, and continued to function even after their internal organs failed. When the researchers finally entered the sealed chamber, they found one prisoner still alive, conscious, and begging not to be put to sleep. The story is fiction. It was written in the early 2010s by an anonymous author. There is no declassified Soviet document, no witness testimony, and no physical evidence to support it. But the story persists because it touches on a real scientific horror. Sleep deprivation experiments have been conducted on animals and, in some cases, on humans. The results are not far from the fiction. The real history of sleep deprivation research begins in the 1890s, when Russian physician Marie de Manesine kept puppies awake until they died. The puppies survived between 4 and 11 days. All died. Autopsies revealed cerebral hemorrhages, damaged neurons, and degeneration of the spinal cord. De Manesine concluded that sleep was not a luxury but a biological necessity. The brain, she argued, requires sleep to clear waste products. Without sleep, the brain poisons itself. Her findings were replicated in rats, cats, and rabbits. In every species tested, total sleep deprivation led to death within days or weeks. The mechanism remained unknown for decades. Modern research has identified the cause. Prolonged wakefulness triggers oxidative stress in neurons, leading to cell death, immune system collapse, and eventually multiple organ failure. The most famous human sleep deprivation experiment was not Soviet but American. In 1964, a 17-year-old high school student named Randy Gardner stayed awake for 264 hours, or 11 days, for a science fair project. He was monitored by Stanford University sleep researcher Dr. William Dement. Gardner experienced mood swings, paranoia, hallucinations, and short-term memory loss. He became convinced that a street sign was a person. He forgot the names of his own siblings. But he did not die. He recovered after sleeping for 14 hours. Critics of the Russian sleep experiment point to Gardner as proof that the story is impossible. 11 days of wakefulness caused severe symptoms but not psychosis or death. 15 days might cause permanent brain damage, but not the supernatural endurance described in the fiction. However, there is a darker thread of real research that the Russian sleep experiment echoes. In the 1980s, Italian neuroscientist Dr. Lamberto Mancia conducted experiments on cats using a device called a treadmill disc. The cats were placed on a disc that rotated slowly whenever the cat began to fall asleep, forcing it to walk to stay upright. This method, known as the disc over water technique, produces total sleep deprivation without the confounding effects of handling or stress. The cats died after 11 to 32 days. Their deaths were not peaceful. They lost weight despite being fed. Their fur fell out. They developed skin lesions that would not heal. Their body temperatures dropped. They stopped grooming. Finally, they collapsed and died. Autopsies showed no single cause of death. Instead, the cats appeared to have simply worn out. Every system in their bodies had failed simultaneously. The disc over water technique was later adapted for rats. The results were even more disturbing. Rats subjected to total sleep deprivation died after 11 to 21 days. But before death, they exhibited a specific pattern of behavior. First, they became hyperactive. They ran on the disc constantly, even when it was not moving. Second, they developed hypothermia. Their bodies could no longer regulate temperature. Third, they lost weight despite eating twice as much as normal rats. Their metabolisms had gone haywire. Finally, they developed ulcers, skin lesions, and bacterial infections. The immune system had collapsed. When researchers examined the rats' brains, they found evidence of oxidative damage in the hippocampus and the brainstem. The rats had not died from exhaustion. They had died because their brains had been poisoned by their own metabolic waste. The Russian sleep experiment borrows heavily from these real findings. The prisoners in the story develop skin lesions, lose their hair, and stop sleeping despite being exhausted. These details are not invented. They are taken from the scientific literature. The fictional addition is the prisoner's psychological state. In the story, the prisoners become violent, paranoid, and eventually inhuman. They tear open their own abdomens. They speak in voices that are not their own. They beg for more gas, more wakefulness, more suffering. This is not science. This is horror fiction. But it is horror fiction built on a foundation of real animal experiments. The researchers who kept cats awake until they died were not monsters. They were trying to understand the fundamental biology of sleep. But their methods were brutal, and the results were terrible to witness. There is no record of any human being kept awake to death in a controlled experiment. The ethical guidelines that govern modern research explicitly forbid it. But there are anecdotal reports from prisoners of war, torture victims, and cult survivors who were subjected to extended sleep deprivation as a means of interrogation or punishment. These reports describe hallucinations, paranoia, and psychotic breaks. They describe a sense of unreality, of the world becoming thin and transparent. They do not describe superhuman endurance or the will to survive beyond biological limits. The human body has limits. Sleep is one of them. The Russian sleep experiment is a myth, but it is a myth that science made possible. The real experiments, the ones with cats and rats and puppies, are almost as disturbing as the fiction. They prove that sleep is not optional. They prove that the brain cannot clean itself while awake. And they prove that scientists, in their quest for knowledge, have sometimes created conditions that resemble the darkest corners of horror literature. The Immortal HeLa cells. On January 29, 1951, a 31-year-old African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks walked into the colored ward of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. She felt a knot inside her cervix. A doctor named Howard Jones examined her and found a malignant tumor. He took a small biopsy, a piece of tissue the size of a pencil eraser, and sent it to the hospital's tissue culture lab. Without telling Henrietta, without asking her permission, without offering her any compensation, a researcher named Dr. George Guy placed her cancer cells in a glass tube with growth medium. He expected them to die. All human cells died after a few days in culture. That was the rule. Henrietta Lacks' cells broke the rule. They did not die. They doubled every 24 hours. They kept doubling. They filled the tube. They filled a second tube. They filled 100 tubes. Dr. Guy had done nothing special. He had simply taken the right cells from the right woman at the right moment. Henrietta Lacks' cervical cancer cells were immortal. They contained an overactive version of the telomerase enzyme, which rebuilds the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes. Normal cells stop dividing after about 50 rounds. HeLa cells, as Dr. Guy named them, have been dividing for more than 70 years. Henrietta Lacks died on October 4, 1951, at the age of 31. She never knew that her cells had become a scientific revolution. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a family cemetery in Clover, Virginia. Meanwhile, her cells were traveling the world. Dr. Guy gave them away freely to any researcher who asked. He did not patent them. He did not sell them. He believed that scientific discoveries should be shared. Within a decade, HeLa cells were in laboratories across the United States, Europe, and Asia. They were used to develop the polio vaccine. They were sent into space to study the effects of zero gravity on human tissue. They were exposed to radiation, to toxins, to viruses, to chemotherapeutic drugs. They were used to understand cancer, AIDS, Ebola, and COVID-19. HeLa cells have been mentioned in more than 100,000 scientific papers. They have been the subject of 11 Nobel Prizes. And they have outlived every scientist who ever worked with them. The terrifying aspect of HeLa cells is not their immortality. The terrifying aspect is their contamination. In the 1960s, researchers discovered that HeLa cells were incredibly aggressive. They grew faster than any other human cell line. They also traveled easily. A single HeLa cell floating through the air could land in a neighboring culture dish and take over. By the time scientists realized this, it was too late. HeLa cells had contaminated hundreds of other cell lines. Researchers around the world had been publishing papers on liver cells, breast cells, and prostate cells that were, in fact, HeLa cells. They had been studying the wrong cells for years. Some estimates suggest that up to 30% of all human cell lines in use during the 1970s were actually HeLa cells. The contamination problem forced a complete reevaluation of laboratory protocols. Today, researchers test their cell lines for HeLa contamination before publishing. But the damage was done. Thousands of scientific papers are now considered unreliable or worthless because they were based on contaminated cells. The ethical horror of HeLa cells is separate from the scientific horror. Henrietta Lacks' family did not learn about the cells until 1975. A researcher contacted them to draw blood samples for genetic testing. The family was confused. What cells? What research? Why had no one told them? When they investigated, they discovered that HeLa cells had been commercialized. Companies were selling vials of their mother's cells for hundreds of dollars each. Millions of dollars had been made. Not a single penny had gone to Henrietta's children or grandchildren. The family was poor. They could not afford health insurance. Some of them could not afford burial plots. Meanwhile, their mother's cells were being shipped in dry ice to every corner of the biomedical industry. The legal and ethical questions raised by HeLa cells have never been fully resolved. In 1951, there was no concept of informed consent for tissue samples. Doctors took whatever they needed. Patients were not asked. The law was on the side of the researchers. In 1990, the California Supreme Court ruled that discarded human tissue is not the property of the person from whom it came. A person cannot sue for profits made from their own cells. This ruling, known as the Moore decision, effectively legalized the HeLa situation. Henrietta Lacks' family could not claim ownership of her cells. They could not demand royalties. They could not stop the research. The only thing they could do was ask for recognition. In 2013, after decades of pressure, the National Institutes of Health reached an agreement with the Lacks family. Researchers must now apply for permission to use HeLa genome data. The family has 2 representatives on the NIH working group, but the cells themselves remain public domain. Any researcher can still order HeLa cells from any biological supply company. The family still receives no money. Henrietta Lacks cells are still dividing. They are still in laboratories around the world. They are still being used to test new drugs, new viruses, new treatments. A single vial of HeLa cells contains more living human cells than the body of the woman from whom they came. Henrietta Lacks has been dead for more than 70 years. But a part of her, a cancerous part, has never stopped growing. The scientists who created the HeLa cell line did not intend to create a monster. They intended to cure disease. But in the process, they created something that the law could not classify, that ethics could not contain, and that time could not kill. HeLa cells are not a monster in the traditional sense. They have no brain, no will, no hunger. But they are a reminder that human tissue, once removed from the body, becomes a separate entity with its own destiny. Henrietta Lacks gave her cells to science without consent. Science gave her nothing in return except immortality. Whether that immortality is a gift or a curse depends entirely on who is asked. The Toxic Lady Incident. On February 19, 1994, a middle-aged woman walked into the emergency department of Riverside Community Hospital in Riverside, California. She was accompanied by her husband. She complained of abdominal pain, nausea, and general weakness. Her symptoms were nonspecific. She looked unwell but not critical. The triage nurse assigned her a bed in the main emergency room. Within minutes, several members of the hospital staff began to feel strange. A nurse named Susan Kane was the first to notice. She felt dizzy. Her head began to spin. She sat down, thinking she had stood up too quickly. Then another nurse felt the same sensation. Then a respiratory therapist. Then a doctor. Within an hour, nearly 24 hospital employees had reported symptoms. Fainting, vomiting, shortness of breath, muscle twitching, and a metallic taste in the mouth. 5 of them required hospitalization. 1, a nurse who had spent the most time with the patient, lost consciousness and remained in intensive care for 2 weeks. The patient herself was not the cause of her own illness. She was the carrier. Her body had become a weapon without her knowledge. The woman was later identified as Gloria Ramirez. She was 31 years old, a mother of 2, and had been diagnosed with advanced cervical cancer. She had been undergoing chemotherapy and radiation treatments for months. Her cancer had spread to her liver, her lungs, and her lymph nodes. She was in pain. She had come to the emergency room because her pain medication was no longer working. That much is certain. Everything else about the Toxic Lady incident remains disputed. What happened in that emergency room has been the subject of multiple investigations, scientific papers, and documentary films. The leading theory, published in the journal Forensic Science International in 1995, is both bizarre and terrifying. The theory proposes that Gloria Ramirez's body had become a factory for the production of a toxic gas. The explanation begins with her cancer treatments. Ramirez had been receiving high doses of dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, a solvent used to deliver chemotherapy drugs through the skin. DMSO is absorbed into the bloodstream and metabolized by the body into dimethyl sulfone, or DMSO2. This compound is normally harmless. It is excreted in urine and sweat. But Ramirez was also receiving oxygen therapy. Her lungs were being flooded with supplemental oxygen. In the presence of a strong electrical field, such as the one generated by a defibrillator or an electrocardiogram machine, DMSO2 can be converted into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is a deadly poison. It is a methylating agent that attacks DNA, proteins, and cell membranes. Exposure causes dizziness, vomiting, muscle spasms, and respiratory failure. The symptoms reported by the hospital staff matched dimethyl sulfate poisoning almost exactly. The electrical field theory was proposed by a team of scientists from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. They suggested that when medical personnel attached electrocardiogram leads to Ramirez's body, the small electrical current passing through her skin may have triggered the conversion of DMSO2 into dimethyl sulfate. The gas then evaporated from her skin and spread through the emergency room. The nurses and doctors who collapsed were the ones closest to her. The ones who fainted later had inhaled the gas after it had dispersed. The theory is plausible but unproven. No one collected air samples from the emergency room that night. No one tested Ramirez's blood or tissues for DMSO2 before she died. She died of kidney failure caused by her cancer at 10:45 p.m. on February 19, 1994. Her body was immediately sealed in a metal casket and buried in a concrete vault. No further testing was possible. There are alternative theories. Some researchers believe that the hospital staff were suffering from mass psychogenic illness, a form of collective hysteria. The symptoms reported were real, but the cause was psychological rather than chemical. The nurses saw their colleagues fainting, so they fainted too. This theory is supported by the fact that no toxic substance was ever identified in the emergency room. It is undermined by the severity of the symptoms. Mass psychogenic illness rarely causes people to lose consciousness for 2 weeks. The nurse who was hospitalized for 14 days had measurable abnormalities in her blood work, including elevated liver enzymes. Those are not psychological. They are physiological. A third theory suggests that Ramirez's body contained a volatile form of mercury. She had been exposed to mercury during her cancer treatments. Mercury poisoning can cause neurological symptoms similar to those reported by the hospital staff. But mercury does not evaporate quickly enough to explain the rapid onset of symptoms. The first nurse felt dizzy within minutes. Mercury vapor poisoning typically takes hours to manifest. The dimethyl sulfate theory remains the most scientifically coherent explanation, even though it has never been proven. The Toxic Lady incident has never been fully solved. The Riverside County Coroner's Office classified Ramirez's death as natural, caused by cervical cancer. The hospital employees who became ill eventually recovered, though some reported lingering symptoms for months. The hospital itself changed its protocols. Today, any patient with a history of DMSO treatment is handled with special precautions, including ventilation and protective equipment. But the incident left a permanent scar on the medical community. It demonstrated that a human body under the right conditions could become a source of chemical warfare. Gloria Ramirez did not intend to harm anyone. She was a dying woman seeking relief from pain. But her cancer, her chemotherapy, and her own metabolism combined to create something that no doctor had ever seen before. Her body became a factory for poison, and the scientists who developed DMSO and oxygen therapy never imagined that their treatments could combine so catastrophically. The Toxic Lady is not a monster. She is a victim, but she is also a warning. Medical treatments can interact in ways that no clinical trial can predict. And sometimes, the most dangerous chemical weapon is not a bomb or a missile. It is a human being, lying on a hospital bed, hooked up to a heart monitor, exhaling death. The blue skin of the Fugates. In the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, along the banks of Troublesome Creek, a family lived for generations with skin the color of a summer sky. They were called the Blue Fugates. Their skin was not painted. It was not a costume or a disease in the usual sense. It was a genetic condition passed from parent to child, carried silently for generations, and only visible when two carriers produced a child. The condition is called methemoglobinemia. It is caused by a recessive gene that alters the way hemoglobin carries oxygen. Normal hemoglobin contains iron in its ferrous state, which binds oxygen and gives blood its red color. Methemoglobin contains iron in its ferric state, which cannot bind oxygen and gives blood a brownish-blue color. When methemoglobin levels rise above 10%, the skin takes on a blue or purple hue. When levels rise above 20%, the person may experience headaches, shortness of breath, and confusion. When levels rise above 50%, death occurs. The Blue Fugates lived with methemoglobin levels between 20 and 30%. They were blue, but they were otherwise healthy. Their condition was not a curse. It was a quirk of chemistry and isolation. The story begins in 1820, when a French orphan named Martin Fugates settled on the banks of Troublesome Creek. Martin carried the recessive gene for methemoglobinemia. He married a local woman named Elizabeth Smith, who also carried the recessive gene. Neither knew it. They had 7 children. Several of them were blue. The Fugate family grew. They intermarried with other local families. The Combs, the Stasis, the Richies. The community was isolated. The mountains made travel difficult. There were no roads, no bridges, no easy way in or out. The Fugates and their neighbors married cousins, nieces, and nephews. The recessive gene multiplied. By the late 19th century, blue-skinned people were a common sight along Troublesome Creek. Outsiders who passed through the region wrote about them in amazement. Some believed the Fugates were suffering from heart disease. Others believed they were a separate race. Neither was correct. They were simply carriers of a rare genetic mutation, amplified by generations of isolation and inbreeding. The science of methemoglobinemia was not understood until the 20th century. In the 1940s, a Kentucky doctor named Madison Quentin traveled to Troublesome Creek to study the blue people. He was a hematologist at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. He had heard rumors of blue-skinned mountaineers and wanted to see for himself. He found them. He met a blue man named Patrick Ritchie and a blue woman named Carrie Fugate. He drew their blood. He analyzed their hemoglobin. He discovered that their red blood cells were deficient in an enzyme called diapherase. This enzyme normally converts methemoglobin back to normal hemoglobin. Without it, methemoglobin accumulates. The condition is benign as long as the methemoglobin level stays below 30%. Above that, oxygen delivery to the tissues becomes compromised. The blue people of Kentucky had learned to live with mild hypoxia. They were not disabled. They simply had less oxygen in their blood than most people. Dr. Quentin found a treatment. He injected the blue people with methylene blue, a dye used in histology and fish tanks. Methylene blue acts as an artificial electron donor, bypassing the missing diapherase enzyme and reducing methemoglobin back to normal hemoglobin. The treatment worked almost instantly. Within minutes, the blue skin faded to pink. Patrick Ritchie, who had been blue for his entire life, watched his own hands turn from blue to normal. He wept. Carrie Fugate, who had been teased as a child for her blue skin, looked in a mirror and saw a different face. The methylene blue treatment was not a cure. It had to be repeated periodically, but it gave the blue people a choice they had never had. They could be blue or they could be pink. Many chose to be pink. By the 1970s, the blue Fugates had largely disappeared from public view. Improved roads and bridges brought new families into the region. The isolation ended. The recessive gene diluted. Today, there are still descendants of Martin Fugate living in eastern Kentucky. Some carry the gene. Very few are blue. The condition requires 2 copies of the recessive gene, 1 from each parent. With a larger gene pool, that combination has become rare. The terror of the blue Fugates is not the terror of radiation or poison or biological weapons. It is the terror of the familiar turned strange. Blue skin is not a color that human beings are supposed to have. When we see a blue person, our brains struggle to categorize them as human. The Fugates were treated as curiosities, as freaks, as something less than fully human. Children threw rocks at them. Adults crossed the street to avoid them. Preachers used them as examples of God's wrath. All of this happened not because the Fugates were dangerous, but because they were different. Their difference was caused by a single enzyme deficiency, a tiny biochemical glitch that changed nothing about their intelligence, their character, or their capacity for love. But the glitch was visible, and visibility in human society is often punishment enough. The scientists who solved the mystery of the blue people did not create the condition. They simply explained it, but their explanation carried its own horror. The Fugates were not cursed. They were not punished. They were the product of a mathematical inevitability. In a small, isolated population, recessive genes accumulate. Inbreeding amplifies them. The same process that produces blue skin also produces hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease, and hundreds of other genetic disorders. The Fugates were not unusual. They were simply visible. Every human population carries recessive mutations. Most of them are invisible. The Fugates' mutation happened to be written on their faces. The scientists who identified the diaphrase deficiency gave the Fugates a choice. They could take methylene blue and blend in. Many did, but the choice itself is a kind of tragedy. The Fugates were not sick. They were not suffering. They were blue, and they were made to feel that being blue was unacceptable. Science fixed their skin. Science could not fix the cruelty that made them want to change it. The self-sacrificing Soviet dogheads. In the 1950s, inside a small laboratory at Moscow State University, a surgeon named Vladimir Demikhov performed an operation that had never been attempted before and has rarely been repeated since. He created two-headed dogs. Demikhov was not a mad scientist. He was a serious, methodical researcher, widely regarded as the father of organ transplantation. He performed the first successful coronary artery bypass in a dog in 1953, years before such procedures were attempted in humans. He developed techniques for lung transplantation, heart transplantation, and liver transplantation. His work laid the foundation for modern transplant surgery. But between these landmark achievements, Demikhov pursued a stranger line of inquiry. He wanted to know if a severed head could be kept alive by attaching it to the circulatory system of another dog. He wanted to know if two heads could share one body. And he wanted to know how long such a creature could survive. Demikhov's first two-headed dog was created in 1954. The procedure was brutal. He took a puppy, typically a small breed like a mongrel or a spaniel, and severed its body just above the shoulders. The puppy's head, with its front legs and upper chest attached, was then grafted onto the neck of a larger dog. Demikhov connected the blood vessels of the smaller dog to the carotid artery and jugular vein of the larger dog. If the procedure succeeded, the larger dog's heart would pump blood through both its own head and the transplanted head. The transplanted head had no lungs of its own, could not breathe, could not eat, could not drink, but it could remain conscious for a time on the borrowed circulation of its host. The first two-headed dog lived for 6 days. The transplanted head licked milk from a saucer when it was placed near its mouth. It growled when the host dog growled. It opened its eyes and tracked movement. Then the host dog's immune system rejected the graft. The transplanted head swelled, turned black, and died. Demikhov was not discouraged. He performed the operation 20 times over the next 15 years. Each time he refined the technique. He used younger puppies whose immune systems were less developed. He used larger host dogs whose circulation could support the extra metabolic demand. He experimented with different attachment points, different suture patterns, different postoperative care protocols. The longest surviving two-headed dog lived for 29 days. During that month, both heads functioned. The host dog ate, drank, walked, and defecated normally. The transplanted head could not eat or drink, but it could lap milk from a saucer, could bark, could bite. In one famous photograph, the transplanted head is shown biting the ear of the host dog. The host dog yelped and tried to shake the smaller head off, but the graft held. The two heads were enemies sharing one body. The host dog could not escape its parasitic twin. The transplanted head could not survive without its host. They were locked together, each suffering the other's presence, until the inevitable rejection killed them both. Demikhov's work was published in Soviet scientific journals but remained largely unknown in the West until the 1960s. When American scientists learned of the two-headed dogs, the reaction was horror. Dr. Denton Cooley, the renowned heart surgeon, called Demikhov's experiments grotesque. Dr. Christian Barnard, who performed the first human heart transplant, acknowledged Demikhov's technical skill but condemned the cruelty of his methods. Demikhov himself was unapologetic. He argued that the two-headed dogs were necessary steps toward understanding transplantation biology. He pointed out that the same techniques he developed for head grafts were later used for kidney, heart, and liver transplants. He saved human lives, but he saved them at a cost that many people found unacceptable. The dogs in his experiments were not anesthetized for the initial surgery, because anesthesia depressed their circulation and reduced the chance of graft survival. They were simply restrained and operated on while conscious. Demikhov did not believe that dogs felt pain the way humans did. Modern veterinarians disagree. The legacy of Demikhov's two-headed dogs is complicated. On one hand, they represent a genuine scientific achievement. Demikhov proved that a severed head could be kept alive by connecting it to another circulatory system. He proved that the brain does not die immediately when separated from the body. He proved that the immune system, not the lack of blood flow, is the primary obstacle to transplantation. These were important discoveries. On the other hand, the two-headed dogs are a symbol of scientific excess. They were created not to cure a specific disease, but to answer a morbid question. Could it be done? And the answer repeatedly was yes, but only for a few weeks, and only at the cost of immense suffering. The dogs could not consent. They could not escape. They could not understand why they had been turned into monsters. They simply lived and suffered and died so that Demikhov could publish another paper. Demikhov died in 1998 at the age of 82. He never expressed regret for his experiments. He saw himself as a pioneer, a man willing to do what others would not, in order to advance the cause of science. But the photographs of his two-headed dogs have outlived him. They circulate on the internet, accompanied by outrage and disgust. They are used as evidence of Soviet barbarism, of scientific arrogance, of the cruelty that humans are willing to inflict on animals in the name of knowledge. Demikhov would have rejected this interpretation. He would have pointed to the thousands of human patients who have received organ transplants thanks to his techniques. He would have said that the suffering of a few dozen dogs was a small price to pay for the salvation of human lives. That argument has logic on its side. But logic is not the same as morality. And the image of a two-headed dog, one head biting the other, is not an image that logic can erase. The self-sacrificing Soviet dog heads are not self-sacrificing at all. They did not choose to sacrifice themselves. They were sacrificed, and the scientists who created them have never been fully forgiven. The CRISPR-Baby Scandal. In November 2018, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui stood before an audience at the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing in Hong Kong. He announced something that most geneticists believed was years away, and many believed should never happen at all. He claimed to have created the first genetically edited human babies. The babies were twin girls, born several weeks earlier. Their names, he revealed, were Lulu and Nana. He had edited their genomes using a tool called CRISPR-Cas9, a molecular scissors that can cut DNA at precise locations. His goal was to disable a gene called CCR5. CCR5 is a protein on the surface of white blood cells. The HIV virus uses CCR5 as a doorway to enter and infect cells. People who naturally lack CCR5, about 1% of the European population, are highly resistant to HIV. He Jiankui wanted to give that resistance to Lulu and Nana. Their father was HIV positive. Their mother was not. He argued that editing the girls' genomes would protect them from possible infection from their father. The scientific community did not believe him. The ethical community was horrified. And the Chinese government, which had not been informed of the experiment, launched an immediate investigation. He Jiankui's methods were as troubling as his goals. He recruited couples through an HIV support group. He offered free in vitro fertilization and free genetic testing. He did not fully explain the risks. He did not offer the couples independent ethical counseling. He edited the embryos at the single-cell stage, meaning that every cell in Lulu and Nana's bodies carries the CRISPR modification. He did not know whether the editing had been successful. He did not know whether it had caused unintended mutations elsewhere in the genome. He did not know whether the girls would develop health problems later in life. He proceeded anyway. In his defense, he claimed that he had followed all applicable Chinese regulations. But there were no applicable regulations. China had not yet established a legal framework for human germline editing. He was operating in a regulatory vacuum, and he knew it. The scientific community's response was immediate and unanimous. More than 100 Chinese scientists signed a letter condemning his work. The International Society for Stem Cell Research called the experiment irresponsible and unethical. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine issued a statement reaffirming that heritable human genome editing should not proceed until safety and efficacy had been proven in animal models and human embryos not intended for pregnancy. He had skipped all of those steps. He had gone directly from laboratory experiments to live births. He had not published his methods in a peer-reviewed journal. He had not shared his data with other researchers. He had not obtained independent ethical approval. He had simply done what he wanted to do and announced it on a stage. The consequences of his experiment are still unfolding. In December 2019, a Chinese court found He Jiankui guilty of illegal medical practice. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and fined approximately $300,000. 2 colleagues received lesser sentences. He was released in April 2022. He has not published any follow-up data on Lulu and Nana. Their current health status is unknown. They are now school-age children. They carry a genetic modification that no human has ever carried before. The modification may protect them from HIV. It may also make them more vulnerable to other diseases. In 2019, a study published in the journal Nature Medicine reported that people who naturally lack CCR5 have a higher risk of death from influenza and a higher risk of severe West Nile virus infection. Another study found that CCR5 deficiency may impair recovery from stroke. The gene that he disabled is not a simple on-off switch. It is part of a complex network. Removing it may have unintended consequences that will not appear until Lulu and Nana are adults. By then, it will be too late to reverse the edit. The CRISPR-Baby scandal is terrifying not because of what He Jiankui did, but because of what it represents. He is not a lone mad scientist. He is a symptom of a larger problem. The technology to edit the human germline exists. It is becoming cheaper and easier every year. A motivated researcher with a modest budget could replicate his experiment. The only barriers are ethical and legal. Those barriers are weaker than most people imagine. Different countries have different regulations. Some have none. A scientist who cannot get approval in one country can simply move to another. The global governance of human germline editing is fragmented, inconsistent, and largely voluntary. There is no international police force for genetic engineering. There is no treaty that binds all nations. There is only a patchwork of guidelines, statements, and best practices. He Jiankui exploited the gaps in that patchwork. Others will follow. The 2 CRISPR babies, Lulu and Nana, are not monsters. They are human children. They have names, parents, and a future that no one can predict. They did not ask to be edited. They did not consent to being experiments. They were born into a controversy not of their making. The scientists who created the CRISPR-Cas9 tool, including Nobel laureates Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna, never intended for it to be used this way. They called for a moratorium on heritable editing years before his announcement. But calls for moratoriums are not laws. And laws are only as strong as the willingness to enforce them. The CRISPR-Baby scandal is a warning. The power to rewrite the human genome is now in human hands. The question is not whether that power will be used. It is already being used. The question is who will decide how and when and for what purpose. He Jiankui made that decision for himself. He decided that 2 baby girls would carry his experiment into the world. They will carry it for the rest of their lives. And their children, if they have any, will carry it too. The CRISPR edit is heritable. It will not disappear. It will become part of the human gene pool, a permanent addition to the story of our species. Whether that addition is a blessing or a curse will not be known for decades. By then, there will likely be more CRISPR babies. The genie is out of the bottle, and no one knows how to put it back. The elephant on LSD. In August 1962, a group of researchers at the University of Oklahoma decided to test a hypothesis. They wanted to know if LSD, the powerful psychedelic drug, could induce a state called must in an elephant. Must is a periodic condition in adult male elephants characterized by highly aggressive behavior and a massive surge in testosterone. During must, elephants have been known to charge at vehicles, uproot trees, and kill rhinoceroses. The researchers believed that must might be caused by a natural chemical similar to LSD. Their reasoning was thin. There was no evidence linking LSD to must. There was no evidence that elephants metabolized LSD the same way humans did. But the researchers had access to an elephant, and they had access to LSD, and they decided to proceed. The elephant's name was Tusko. He was a 14-year-old Asian elephant, weighing approximately 6 tons. He lived at the Oklahoma City Zoo. He was not in must. He was calm, healthy, and accustomed to human handlers. The researchers wanted to change that. They wanted to make him angry. They succeeded beyond their worst expectations. The experiment was led by Dr. Louis Jolyon West, a psychiatrist and LSD researcher who had previously studied the drug's effects on humans and animals. West believed that LSD could be used to simulate psychosis. He had given LSD to cats, dogs, and monkeys. He had given LSD to human volunteers. Now he wanted to give it to an elephant. The dose he chose was 297 milligrams. To understand how massive this dose was, consider that a typical human dose of LSD is 0.1 milligrams. A strong human dose is 0.2 milligrams. West gave Tusko nearly 3,000 times the human dose. He did not calculate the dose based on the elephant's body weight. If he had, he would have arrived at a dose of approximately 0.5 to 1 milligram, roughly 5 to 10 times the human dose. Instead, he seems to have assumed that elephants, being large, needed a proportionally large dose. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. LSD is not metabolized by body weight. It is metabolized by brain volume and liver capacity. An elephant's brain is only about 3 times larger than a human brain. Its liver is larger, but not 3,000 times larger. West overdosed Tusko by a factor of several hundred. The method of administration was equally reckless. The researchers loaded the LSD into a dart gun. They shot Tusko from a distance. The elephant was standing in his enclosure, unsedated, unaware of what was about to hit him. The dart struck him in the flank. The LSD entered his bloodstream within seconds. The researchers later wrote a scientific paper describing what happened next. The paper was published in the journal Science in 1962. It is one of the most disturbing documents in the history of psychopharmacology. According to the paper, Tusko began to show signs of distress within 5 minutes. He trumpeted loudly. He staggered. He collapsed onto his side. His legs began to paddle uncontrollably. His eyes rolled back. He defecated and urinated. He went into status epilepticus, a continuous seizure state that can cause brain damage and death. The researchers did not have a veterinary plan. They did not have an antidote. They did not have any experience with LSD overdoses in large animals. They watched as Tusko convulsed on the ground. 20 minutes after the injection, they decided to intervene. They injected Tusko with a massive dose of a barbiturate tranquilizer. The tranquilizer suppressed his breathing. 5 minutes later, Tusko died. The entire experiment, from injection to death, lasted less than an hour. The scientific paper that resulted from this experiment was titled LSD-25 in an Elephant. It was co-authored by West and 2 colleagues. The paper concluded that LSD had caused Tusko to go into a state of acute psychotic excitement, leading to collapse and death. The paper did not acknowledge that the dose was wildly inappropriate. It did not acknowledge that the researchers had made a basic miscalculation. It did not acknowledge that the experiment had been conducted without veterinary oversight or ethical review. The paper simply reported what happened and moved on. For decades, it was cited in the scientific literature as evidence that LSD could be lethal to large animals. No one questioned the dose. No one pointed out that 297 milligrams would kill a human, a horse, a cow, and probably a whale. The paper stood as a monument to scientific carelessness until the 1990s, when a veterinarian named Dr. Donald M. J. Smith re-examined the case. Smith calculated the correct dose based on body surface area, a more accurate metric for cross-species drug dosing. He concluded that West had used a dose approximately 300 times too high. Tusko died not from LSD toxicity, but from asphyxiation caused by the combination of the LSD-induced seizure and the barbiturate tranquilizer. He died because his handlers panicked. He died because they did not know what they were doing. The elephant on LSD is a story about arrogance disguised as science. The researchers who killed Tusko were not evil. They were curious. They wanted to understand the relationship between chemicals and behavior. But their curiosity was not tempered by caution. They assumed that an elephant was just a large dog. They assumed that a drug that was safe for humans at 0.1 milligrams would be safe for elephants at 297 milligrams. They did not check their assumptions. They did not consult a veterinarian. They did not obtain ethical approval. In 1962, such approval was not required. Animal research was largely unregulated. Researchers could do almost anything they wanted to any animal they could acquire. The Animal Welfare Act, the first federal law regulating animal research in the United States, was not passed until 1966. Came too late for Testicle. He was already dead, buried somewhere on the grounds of the Oklahoma City Zoo. His grave unmarked and now forgotten. The legacy of the elephant on LSD is not scientific. It is cautionary. The experiment is taught in veterinary schools as an example of how not to calculate drug doses. It is cited in ethics courses as an example of how not to treat animal subjects. It is remembered by the public as a bizarre and senseless tragedy. Testicle did not need to die. His death served no purpose. The researchers learned nothing that could not have been learned from a much smaller dose, or from a computer model, or from a literature review. They killed an elephant because they were in a hurry, because they were curious, and because no one stopped them. The scientists who created this terrifying event did not set out to create a monster. They set out to publish a paper. But the paper they published became a monument to their own failure. And Testicle, the gentle giant who never asked to be part of any experiment, became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when science forgets its responsibility to the living beings it studies. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In August 1971, a psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo transformed the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a mock prison. He recruited 24 male college students through a newspaper advertisement. The advertisement promised $15 per day for 2 weeks of participation in a psychological study of prison life. The applicants were screened for psychological stability and criminal history. Zimbardo selected the healthiest, most normal, most well-adjusted young men he could find. He then randomly divided them into 2 groups, prisoners and guards. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by actual Palo Alto police officers, booked, fingerprinted, and led blindfolded into the basement prison. They wore smocks with ID numbers, nylon caps over their hair, and a chain around one ankle. The guards wore khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and carried wooden batons. They were instructed to maintain order but not to use physical violence. Zimbardo himself took the role of prison superintendent. He gave the guards one explicit instruction: create a sense of powerlessness in the prisoners. He did not anticipate how enthusiastically the guards would obey. The experiment was scheduled to last 14 days. It was terminated after 6. The reason for the early termination was not a lack of data. It was a surfeit of horror. Within 36 hours, one prisoner had suffered a complete emotional breakdown. He was released. Within 72 hours, 3 more prisoners had broken down. The guards had escalated their tactics. They forced prisoners to do push-ups. They forced them to clean toilet bowls with their bare hands. They forced them to simulate sodomy. They withheld food and bathroom privileges. They placed prisoners in solitary confinement, a dark closet measuring 2 feet by 2 feet. The prisoners, for their part, became passive, depressed, and compliant. They accepted the guards' authority as if the prison were real. They stopped rebelling. They stopped believing that the experiment would end. Some prisoners developed rashes, crying spells, and disorganized thinking. One prisoner went on a hunger strike. The guards force-fed him. Zimbardo watched all of this through one-way mirrors. He did not stop it. He later admitted that he had lost his own perspective. He was no longer a professor observing an experiment. He had become the superintendent of a prison, invested in maintaining the institution he had created. The experiment ended when a graduate student named Christina Maslach visited the basement. Maslach was Zimbardo's girlfriend, later his wife. She saw the prisoners being led to the bathroom with bags over their heads. She saw the guards shouting and swaggering. She saw the blind obedience of the prisoners. She was horrified. She told Zimbardo that what he was doing was immoral. She told him that he was allowing human beings to be abused. Zimbardo initially dismissed her concerns. Then he thought about what she had said. The next day, he terminated the experiment. The prisoners were released. The guards were debriefed. Zimbardo wrote a book about the experiment, titled The Lucifer Effect, in which he argued that ordinary people can be transformed into perpetrators of evil by the power of social roles and institutional structures. The Stanford prison experiment became one of the most famous and most controversial studies in the history of psychology. It was cited in textbooks, taught in classrooms, and referenced in court cases about prison conditions. It was also, as later investigations revealed, deeply flawed. Critics have pointed out that Zimbardo did not maintain scientific objectivity. He participated in the experiment as superintendent, giving instructions to the guards and shaping the very behavior he was supposed to be observing. He did not control for demand characteristics. The guards knew that Zimbardo wanted them to be tough. They gave him what he wanted. Some guards later admitted that they had been play-acting, imitating guards from movies like Cool Hand Luke. The prisoners also admitted that they had been play-acting, pretending to be more distressed than they actually were. The most famous moment of the experiment, in which a prisoner allegedly had a psychotic breakdown and screamed, "I'm burning up inside," was later revealed to have been partially staged. The prisoner, Douglas Corpy, later said that he had been acting to get out of the experiment. He was not actually having a breakdown. He was faking. The guards' cruelty, however, was not entirely fake. Some guards genuinely enjoyed humiliating the prisoners. One guard, later nicknamed John Wayne, was described by other participants as genuinely sadistic. Zimbardo did not remove him. The Stanford prison experiment created something terrifying not because it revealed the true nature of humanity, but because it became a justification for cruelty. For decades, prison officials and military interrogators cited the experiment to argue that abuse is inevitable in hierarchical institutions. If ordinary college students could become abusive in just 6 days, the argument went, then no one can be blamed for abuse. The system is the cause. This argument exonerates perpetrators and absolves institutions of responsibility. It also ignores the fact that many guards in the experiment did not become abusive. Some were kind. Some fed the prisoners when they were not supposed to. Some apologized to the prisoners after the experiment ended. The experiment did not prove that everyone becomes evil in a bad system. It proved that some people become evil, some people resist, and the person in charge can choose which behavior to encourage. Zimbardo spent the rest of his career defending the experiment and expanding its conclusions. He testified as an expert witness for one of the guards accused of abuse at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. He argued that the abuse was caused by systemic factors, not individual sadism. The guard was convicted anyway. The Stanford prison experiment remains a powerful cautionary tale, but not for the reasons Zimbardo intended. It is a cautionary tale about the seduction of power, the blindness of authority, and the willingness of scientists to cross ethical boundaries in pursuit of a dramatic result. The scientists who created the Stanford prison did not create a monster made of flesh. They created a monster made of roles, rules, and rationalizations. And that monster has outlived the experiment itself, lurking in the assumptions of everyone who believes that ordinary people are just one uniform away from becoming torturers. The San Quentin testicle transplants. Between 1910 and 1950, a surgeon named Dr. Leo Stanley conducted a series of experiments inside California's San Quentin State Prison that would be unthinkable today. Stanley was the chief surgeon at San Quentin. He was responsible for the medical care of thousands of inmates. He took that responsibility seriously, but he also believed that he could improve human health and behavior through the transplantation of testicular tissue. Stanley's logic was rooted in the early 20th century understanding of endocrinology. Scientists had recently discovered that the testes produce hormones, including testosterone, that influence strength, mood, and libido. Stanley believed that aging men lost their vitality because their testes stopped working. He believed that criminals were criminals because their testes were defective. He believed that by transplanting healthy testicular tissue from younger, stronger, or recently executed men, he could rejuvenate the old, cure the sick, and rehabilitate the criminal. He tested these beliefs on hundreds of inmates. His methods were crude. His results were imaginary. And his legacy is a monument to scientific overreach. Stanley began his experiments with a simple procedure. He would remove the testicles from a recently deceased inmate, typically one who had been executed by hanging. He would then slice the testicles into small pieces and transplant these pieces into the abdominal cavities of living inmates. The procedure did not require blood vessel reattachment. Stanley simply placed the tissue inside the abdomen, sewed the incision closed, and hoped that the body would absorb the hormones before rejecting the foreign tissue. He performed this operation on hundreds of men. He claimed that the transplants produced dramatic results: increased energy, improved mood, reduced homosexual urges, and even the reversal of aging. He published his findings in medical journals. Other doctors were skeptical. They pointed out that Stanley had no control group, no objective measurements, and no follow-up data. They also pointed out that testicular tissue, when transplanted without blood supply, dies within hours. Any hormones it releases are minimal. Any benefits reported by Stanley's patients were almost certainly the placebo effect. Stanley ignored his critics. He continued transplanting. When the supply of executed inmates ran low, Stanley improvised. He began using testicles from rams, goats, deer, and boars. He would slaughter the animal, remove its testicles, and transplant the tissue into his human patients. He claimed that animal testicles worked as well as human testicles. He also claimed that the species of the donor did not matter. A goat's testicle, he wrote, could make an old man feel young again. A ram's testicle could turn a passive inmate into an aggressive one. A boar's testicle could restore sexual potency. These claims had no scientific basis. The human immune system attacks foreign tissue from other humans. It attacks tissue from other species even more aggressively. The animal testicles would have been destroyed within hours, releasing no sustained hormone signal. But Stanley's patients believed they were receiving powerful treatments. They reported feeling stronger, happier, and more masculine. Placebo is a powerful drug. Stanley mistook it for proof. The most disturbing phase of Stanley's experiments involved living donors. He persuaded younger, healthier inmates to donate one of their testicles. The donors were promised nothing in return except the satisfaction of helping others. Some donors were executed criminals, donating their testicles hours before their hanging. Others were volunteers who underwent elective orchiectomy, the surgical removal of a testicle, for no medical reason. Stanley would then transplant the living donor's testicle into an older inmate. He believed that living tissue would survive longer than cadaveric tissue. He was correct, but only marginally. The transplanted testicle would survive for a few days or weeks before being rejected. During that time, it might produce some testosterone, but not enough to produce the dramatic effects Stanley claimed. The donors, meanwhile, were left with one testicle. Some suffered complications. Some regretted their decision. Stanley did not track long-term outcomes. He did not provide follow-up care. He simply moved on to the next transplant. Stanley's experiments were not secret. He published dozens of papers in respected medical journals. He presented his findings at conferences. He was elected to the American Medical Association. The medical establishment of his era did not condemn him. It largely ignored him. The ethical standards of the early 20th century were different. There were no institutional review boards. There were no informed consent requirements. Prisoners were considered an ideal population for medical experiments because they were confined, available, and had no legal recourse. Stanley believed he was helping his patients. He was not charging them. He was not harming them, in his view. He was offering them a chance at rejuvenation. Many inmates volunteered. Some volunteered repeatedly. Stanley's reputation within San Quentin was positive. Inmates called him the kind doctor. They trusted him. He repaid that trust by cutting open their abdomens and inserting pieces of goat testicle. The terror of the San Quentin testicle transplants is not the terror of visible monsters. It is the terror of invisible boundaries crossed. Stanley violated the most basic principle of medical ethics: do no harm. He removed healthy testicles from living donors. He transplanted animal tissue into human beings. He made extraordinary claims based on no evidence. He continued his experiments for 40 years. No one stopped him. No one arrested him. No one revoked his medical license. He retired in 1950, honored by his colleagues, and died in 1970 at the age of 84. The inmates he operated on are long dead. Their medical records are sealed. The full extent of Stanley's work may never be known, but the lesson of his career is clear. Science without ethics is not science. It is ritual. Stanley believed he was performing a medical miracle. He was actually performing a medical fantasy, carved into the bodies of prisoners who had no other options. The scientists who created the San Quentin testicle transplants did not create a monster that can be photographed or dissected. They created a monster that lives in the history of medicine. The monster of unchecked authority, of good intentions without evidence, of a doctor who forgot that his patients were people. The monster maker of Paris. In the 1950s, inside a laboratory at the Collège de France in Paris, a biologist named Etienne Wolf dedicated his career to the systematic creation of living malformations. Wolf was not a monster. He was a respected embryologist, a member of the French Academy of Sciences, and a pioneer in the field of experimental teratology. Teratology is the study of birth defects. Its goal is to understand how normal development goes wrong, with the ultimate aim of preventing human deformities. Wolf pursued this goal with relentless precision. He used chicken embryos as his subjects. They were cheap, abundant, and developed outside the mother's body, making them easy to observe and manipulate. Wolf subjected thousands of chicken embryos to a variety of interventions: chemical poisons, radiation, surgical cuts, and genetic mutations. He then documented the results with photographs and drawings. The results were grotesque. Wolf created chickens with 2 heads, 3 eyes, 4 legs, no beak, exposed brains, and hearts beating outside their bodies. He created cyclops chickens with a single eye in the middle of their foreheads. He created chickens with legs growing out of their eye sockets. He created chickens with intestines trailing behind them like umbilical cords. He called them his monsters. The name stuck. Wolf became known in scientific circles and eventually in popular culture as the monster maker of Paris. Wolf's methods were meticulous. He worked under a dissecting microscope, using fine glass needles and microscissors to cut embryos at specific stages of development. He learned that the same intervention could produce different results depending on when it was applied. A cut to the neural tube at 24 hours produced a chick with an open brain. The same cut at 30 hours produced a chick with a missing eye. The same cut at 48 hours produced a normal chick. Wolf mapped the critical periods of development, the narrow windows during which each organ is vulnerable to disruption. He published his findings in dozens of papers and several books. His work was foundational for the field of teratology. Every modern scientist who studies birth defects stands on Wolf's shoulders. But the path to that knowledge was paved with images of suffering. Wolf did not believe that chicken embryos could feel pain. He was almost certainly wrong. By the 1950s, it was known that birds have nervous systems capable of nociception, the detection of harmful stimuli. A chicken embryo in the later stages of development can move away from a hot needle, can change its heart rate in response to touch, can vocalize, though it has no air in its lungs to produce sound. Whether an embryo with an exposed brain or a missing face can feel pain is a question that Wolf did not ask. He was a scientist of his era. He assumed that animals were mechanisms. He assumed that embryos were not yet fully alive. He assumed that his work was justified by its potential to prevent human suffering. Those assumptions allowed him to look at his monsters without flinching. They allowed him to preserve the monsters in jars of formaldehyde and display them at scientific conferences. They allowed him to lecture about his methods to audiences of medical students, who were simultaneously horrified and fascinated. The most disturbing aspect of Wolf's work is not the monsters themselves. It is the systematic, almost artistic care with which he created them. Wolf did not simply poison embryos and see what happened. He designed specific malformations. He wanted to know exactly which cut, at exactly which hour, produced exactly which defect. He repeated each experiment dozens of times to ensure consistency. He photographed each result from multiple angles. He published the photographs in his books, sometimes in color, always with detailed captions. The photographs are beautiful in a terrible way. They show the limits of biological form. They show how easily the elegant architecture of the developing body can be twisted into chaos. They show that there is no sharp line between normal and abnormal, only a continuum of variation, and that a skilled scientist can place his finger anywhere on that continuum and push. Wolf's monsters were not kept alive for long. Chicken embryos develop fully in 21 days. Most of wolf specimens died before hatching. Those that did hatch were usually unable to eat, breathe, or move. Wolf euthanized them quickly. He was not cruel in the sense of enjoying suffering. He was cruel in the sense of being indifferent to it. His indifference was not personal. It was professional. He believed that the knowledge he gained would save human lives. He was correct. The same critical period mapping that Wolf pioneered is now used to advise pregnant women about which medications to avoid and when. Thalidomide, a drug that caused thousands of birth defects in the 1960s, causes defects only when taken during a specific window of pregnancy. That window was discovered using techniques that Wolf developed. The monster maker of Paris helped prevent the next generation of monsters. The irony is bitter but undeniable. Wolf died in 1996 at the age of 92. He never apologized for his work. He never expressed regret. He saw himself as a soldier in the war against birth defects, and soldiers do not apologize for casualties. But the photographs of his monsters outlived him. They circulate on the internet, stripped of context, presented as evidence of scientific depravity. They are used by animal rights activists to argue that all animal experimentation is torture. They are used by anti-abortion activists to argue that embryos are fully human. They are used by conspiracy theorists to argue that scientists are creating monsters in secret laboratories. Wolf would have rejected all of these interpretations. He would have said that his monsters were tools, not ends. He would have said that a chicken embryo is not a human child. He would have said that the suffering of a few thousand birds is a small price to pay for the prevention of thousands of human birth defects. That argument has logic on its side. But logic is not the same as comfort. And the monster maker of Paris is not a comfortable figure. He is a reminder that science often advances through ugliness. The path to knowledge is not always beautiful. Sometimes it is lined with jars of formaldehyde, each containing a two-headed chicken, each a testament to what happens when a scientist decides that understanding is worth any cost. Project Artichoke. Before there was MKUltra, there was Project Artichoke. The name was a random code assigned by the Central Intelligence Agency. The mission was anything but random. In 1951, at the height of the Cold War, the CIA became obsessed with a single question. The question was written into internal memos, declassified decades later, and it still chills the reader. The CIA asked, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation?" This was not a philosophical exercise. It was an operational goal. The CIA wanted to create human puppets. They wanted to force prisoners to betray their countries, reveal secrets, and even commit murder. They wanted to erase memories, implant commands, and turn human beings into weapons that could be triggered at will. Project Artichoke was their first systematic attempt to achieve this goal. It lasted from 1951 to 1953. The successor, MKUltra, lasted another decade. But Artichoke established the blueprint for everything that followed. Project Artichoke was not an isolated program. It was the result of growing American fear about communist brainwashing techniques. During the Korean War, American prisoners of war had appeared to cooperate with their captors, confessing to crimes they did not commit and rejecting their own country. The military called this brainwashing. The CIA called it a threat. They believed that the Soviets and Chinese had developed methods to break the human mind completely. The intelligence community wanted those same methods for themselves. Artichoke was their answer. The project was operated by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, with cooperation from the intelligence divisions of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the FBI. It was a coordinated, multi-agency assault on the boundaries of human consciousness. The methods explored under Project Artichoke were varied and horrifying. The primary tools were hypnosis, drugs, and isolation. Hypnosis was considered the most promising avenue. CIA researchers believed that a skilled hypnotist could implant post-hypnotic suggestions that would trigger specific behaviors days or weeks later. A person under hypnosis could be told to forget the hypnotic session entirely. Then, when a specific code word was spoken, the person would carry out the command. The CIA tested this on subjects in clinical settings. According to declassified documents, researchers found that under laboratory conditions, subjects could be made to do things they would not otherwise do. The documents mention setting fires and shooting people as examples of commands that hypnotized subjects followed. The subjects had no memory of the commands afterward. They believed they had acted of their own free will. Drugs were the second pillar of Artichoke. The CIA experimented with a wide range of chemicals. Barbiturates like sodium amytal and sodium pentothal, known as truth serums, were used to lower inhibitions and make subjects more talkative. Stimulants were used to keep subjects awake and disoriented. The CIA also experimented with heroin, cocaine, marijuana, peyote, and mescaline. But the most promising drug, in their view, was LSD. LSD had been discovered in 1943. By 1951, the CIA was already exploring its potential. Artichoke researchers gave LSD to unwitting subjects, including CIA agents themselves. One record states that an agent was kept on LSD for 77 days. The purpose was to observe the long-term effects of psychosis and to determine whether a person under LSD could be programmed with new beliefs or behaviors. The third pillar of Artichoke was isolation and sensory deprivation. The CIA established secret prisons in West Germany, Japan, and the Panama Canal Zone. These facilities were used to interrogate suspected double agents, defectors, and prisoners of war. Subjects were kept in total isolation, deprived of light, sound, and human contact. They were subjected to extreme temperatures, electroshock, and sleep deprivation. The goal was to break down the subject's sense of self, making them more suggestible and easier to control. Some subjects were then given drugs or hypnosis. Others were simply interrogated until they broke. The CIA believed that the combination of isolation, drugs, and hypnosis would produce a state of total compliance. Whether they succeeded is unclear. What is clear is that subjects were often left with permanent psychological damage. The most disturbing goal of Project Artichoke was the creation of unwitting assassins. A January 1954 CIA document explicitly discussed whether a person could be surreptitiously drugged through the medium of an alcoholic cocktail at a social party, and then triggered to commit murder. The document stated that if hypnosis succeeded, assassins could be created to kill a prominent, redacted politician or, if necessary, an American official. The redaction in the declassified document hides the name of the intended target. But the intention is clear. The CIA was willing to turn human beings into disposable weapons. They did not care about consent. They did not care about long-term consequences. They cared only about whether it could be done. Project Artichoke also explored biological weapons. A declassified memo from the project reads, "Not all viruses have to be lethal. The objective includes those that act as short-term and long-term incapacitating agents." The CIA researched dengue fever and other diseases as potential tools for incapacitating targets. The idea was not to kill, but to disable. A person suffering from a high fever cannot resist interrogation. A person weakened by illness cannot fight back. The CIA wanted the ability to make people sick on demand. Whether they ever deployed such agents is unknown. The documents are incomplete. The human cost of Project Artichoke is difficult to calculate. Most records were destroyed in 1973 on the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms. What remains are fragments, memos, financial records, and a few testimony transcripts. These fragments mention prisoners, mental patients, and refugees being used as subjects without their knowledge or consent. They mention overseas operations in Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. They mention teams of researchers who were told to conduct at the overseas bases operational experiments utilizing aliens as subjects. The word aliens here does not mean extraterrestrials. It means foreign nationals, people with no legal protection, people who could be disappeared without anyone noticing. These were the perfect subjects for a program that valued secrecy above humanity. Project Artichoke was officially folded into MKUltra in 1953. The new program had broader funding and even fewer ethical constraints. But Artichoke established the template. It proved that the CIA was willing to experiment on human beings. It proved that the agency was willing to break the law, violate medical ethics, and destroy lives in pursuit of an unattainable goal. The scientists who created Project Artichoke were not monsters in the usual sense. They were bureaucrats, researchers, and intelligence officers. They wrote memos about control of activity of individuals whether they wish it or not. They discussed surgical, e.g. lobotomy, as a tool for behavior modification. They coldly calculated how to turn human beings into puppets. And then they tried to do it. They failed. The perfect mind-controlled assassin never existed. But the attempt left a trail of damaged lives, destroyed documents, and a permanent stain on the history of American intelligence. Project Artichoke is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not created in science fiction. They are created in government offices, by people who believe that the ends justify any means. The Soviet anthrax leak. On April 2, 1979, a mysterious outbreak of anthrax occurred in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Ekaterinburg. The Soviet government told the world a simple story. The outbreak, they said, was caused by contaminated meat. Residents had eaten illegally slaughtered animals. The meat contained anthrax spores. People became sick. Some died. The story was plausible. Anthrax is a zoonotic disease, transmitted from animals to humans. But the Soviet story had a problem. The outbreak did not look like a foodborne illness. The victims did not have the intestinal form of anthrax. They had the inhalation form. Inhalation anthrax occurs when spores are breathed into the lungs. It is almost always fatal. It is also almost always the result of an industrial or military accident. The victims of the Sverdlovsk outbreak lived in a narrow geographical band downwind of a secret Soviet military facility called Compound 19, also known as the Institute of Applied Microbiology. The facility was a biological weapons laboratory. The Soviet government was lying. The truth, when it finally emerged, was far more terrifying than contaminated meat. The Sverdlovsk anthrax leak was not a leak in the sense of a slow drip. It was a catastrophic failure of industrial hygiene. On that April morning, a worker at Compound 19 removed a clogged filter from an exhaust system. The filter was supposed to be sterilized before removal. It was not. The worker failed to follow protocol. He removed the filter while it was still contaminated with anthrax spores. The exhaust system was connected to the outside air. The spores were blown into the atmosphere. The wind carried them southeast, toward the residential neighborhoods of Sverdlovsk. The exact number of spores released is unknown. Estimates range from a few grams to several kilograms. Anthrax spores are almost indestructible. They can survive in soil for decades. They can be carried on clothing, shoes, and tires. They are invisible, odorless, and tasteless. The residents of Sverdlovsk had no idea that death was drifting toward them on the morning breeze. The first victims began showing symptoms within days. Inhalation anthrax begins like a common cold. Fever, cough, muscle aches. Then, abruptly, it becomes something else. The bacteria multiply in the lymph nodes of the chest. They release toxins that cause hemorrhaging and swelling. The lungs fill with fluid. The victim cannot breathe. Death follows within 24 to 48 hours. The Soviet doctors who treated the victims were confused. They had never seen an outbreak of inhalation anthrax. They did not know what they were dealing with. The Soviet government did know. Compound 19 was a military facility. The local military commander was informed immediately. He ordered an investigation. He also ordered a cover-up. The victims were not told that they had been exposed to a biological weapon. Their families were not told. The doctors were not told. The Soviet Ministry of Health was not told until weeks later, when the outbreak could no longer be hidden. The official death toll from the Sverdlovsk anthrax leak is 64. The unofficial death toll is much higher. Western intelligence agencies estimated that at least 100 people died. Some estimates go as high as 200. The true number will never be known. The Soviet government destroyed records. Bodies were cremated before autopsies could be performed. Families were told that their loved ones had died of pneumonia, food poisoning, or plague. Many believed the lies. Others did not. In the years after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian scientists and dissidents began to speak publicly about what had happened. A pathologist named Dr. Lev Fyodorov collected testimony from survivors and family members. He published his findings in the Russian press. He concluded that the outbreak was far larger and far deadlier than the government had admitted. He also concluded that Compound 19 was not a civilian vaccine facility, as the Soviets claimed. It was a biological weapons laboratory. Its purpose was to develop and produce anthrax for military use. The Sverdlovsk anthrax leak was not an accident in the sense of a natural disaster. It was an accident caused by human negligence, enabled by secrecy, and compounded by lies. The scientists who worked at Compound 19 were not evil. They were researchers, many of them highly trained, many of them sincere in their belief that they were defending their country. But they were working with one of the most dangerous pathogens known to humanity. They were working in a facility that had inadequate safety systems. They were working under a government that valued secrecy over transparency. And when the accident happened, their first instinct was not to save lives. Their first instinct was to protect the program. The filter was removed improperly. The spores were released. The people died. And the scientists said nothing. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian President Boris Yeltsin finally admitted the truth. The Sverdlovsk outbreak was caused by a leak from a military biological weapons facility. Yeltsin apologized to the families of the victims. He promised an investigation. The investigation was never completed. The documents remained classified. The facility at Compound 19 was eventually decommissioned, but not before it had produced hundreds of tons of anthrax spores. The Sverdlovsk anthrax leak is a warning. Biological weapons are not theoretical. They exist. They have been produced, stockpiled, and accidentally released. The scientists who created them believed they were building a deterrent. They believed that the threat of anthrax would prevent war. Instead, they created a pathogen that killed their own citizens. The wind did not check passports. The spores did not ask whether the people breathing them were soldiers or civilians. They simply killed whoever was downwind. The Soviet anthrax leak is the final story in this series because it represents the ultimate terror of science. Knowledge without wisdom, power without accountability, and the inability to call back the wind once it has begun to blow. Ending. And that's our list. 20 times scientists pushed too far and created something truly terrifying. If you made it this far, you're the kind of viewer who likes to think deeply about science, ethics, and the dark side of human curiosity. So do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells YouTube to show this video to more people who actually care. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this coming. Drop a comment. Tell me which case scared you the most, or if you know another one I missed. And yeah, send this video to a friend who needs to lose a little sleep tonight. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, but maybe a little careful.